Well, I suppose it's time to make love. That's right. This episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. And
Concerned about thumbnails.
Gentlemen, this is the problem here. There's a headline in, I believe this was the New York Times, maybe Wall Street Journal. Suddenly, there aren't enough babies. The whole world is alarmed. This was the Journal, I think. The birth rate is worldwide is very close to slipping below the replacement rate. In other words, population, which we were told in the 1970s was going to explode and make the planet unlivable because we'd all be shoulder to shoulder and we wouldn't be able to, support ourselves, now is expected to drop off substantially from previous projections. And the United States is already below replacement rate. South Korea is below replacement rate. But overall, the whole globe, including places like India and Africa, like the nations of Africa. We went from, in the 1950s, the United Nations estimate of live births per woman was 4.86. It is now, in 2021, it was 2.32. And so you say, well, what's the big deal about that, Steve Green? I mean, after all, people are working two jobs. They're busy. They don't have time to have kids. Kids are expensive, blah, blah, blah. Actually, as it turns out, kids are no more expensive today than they've ever been. But Steve, let me just give you a short list of some of the problems caused by not enough babies. Labor shortages, shortages of funding for government programs like healthcare and retirement for aging Americans, a decrease in GDP both nationally and globally, reduced funding for school districts, difficulty filling college classrooms and therefore maintaining universities themselves, stagnating property values as demand decreases. And Steve,
Boy, I'd love
I
to
know
see
this.
that one, if you want to
This
buy it.
sounds so strange to say, but really the best thing that young people could do to make the world a better place going forward and to make sure that people could be cared for and to make sure that their kids have a better future, or if they have kids, if they don't have kids, children the age of the kids that they would have had. The best thing that you can do as a young person now is to go out and make babies.
And
But
it's fun.
Who can force this generation to do what we used to consider one of the most enjoyable things ever?
Oh man, and you left out one of the I don't know,
I left a lot
scariest
out.
is the right words, but one of the biggest problems facing a shrinking population is the accumulated debt. We've got 35 trillion reasons almost right now that we better have bigger families, because if you have a population of 330 million people sitting on top of $35 trillion of debt, that's a problem. If you've got 1 billion people sitting on top of that much debt, all other things being equal, it's a much smaller problem. In fact, it's smaller by a lot. And then if you have a population that's slowly shrinking and that debt is slowly accumulating or quickly accumulating, as we've been doing these last few years, then you have a serious problem, because that interest you have to pay on the debt consumes more and more of everything that everybody has to do on every single paycheck. And I hate to be a downer, but that's the truth. Think of it as, I have 2 sons, love them to death. I would have loved to have had a third. Except I didn't meet the right girl till I was almost 32 years old. We didn't manage to have the first baby till I was 35, 36, whatever it was. And by the time we were done with the second one, I'm like, okay, I got to nope out. I'm already going to be almost 60 by the time the second one graduates from high school. That's it. I'm done. But the kids are great. Babies are great. They're a pain in the ass, and they're magical, and they'll break your heart, and they'll make you burst with pride. And it's just, I will be on my deathbed looking back at those two going, those are the best 2 things I ever did. Again, wish I could have had a third, but that's neither here nor there. Scott, what's really interesting is a couple of things. One is how much of this is a social phenomenon, not a wealth problem, as you indicated in your intro.
Yeah.
China started the one-child policy in 1976 when China was a very poor country, just dirt poor. And for 2 or 3 generations now, they had the one-child policy in place, and China became a very wealthy country. China now has a middle class bigger than the entire population of the United States. Just their middle class, 400 million people. That's huge. And these people aren't having kids. Because even though the one-child policy got rescinded several years ago, the social norm now is to have one or none children. And we've seen the same thing, Japan and West Germany. Now Germany really led the way on this. But it completely infected the West. Everything from super rich Germany to not very rich Russia. And it's hit here. We're below the replacement rate. We have been for several years now, since about 2012 or so, I believe. The only reason why our population is growing is immigration. I wish it weren't so illegal. I wish we had some border controls and we were saying, okay, let's not let in the criminals and let's have a nice process for the hardworking folks. But that's neither here nor there. But what's interesting now is this social contagion, if that's the right phrase for it, has even reached Africa, where up until very recently, huge family sizes were still the norm. But now even places like Nigeria are heading towards that 2.3, 2.2, 2.1 level where you start getting to no growth. And Scott, I don't know how all this ends. But if it ends with the human race just kind of going away because we got too cool to have kids, that might be the biggest tragedy. No, that would be the biggest tragedy anybody could ever imagine.
Bill Whittle, there's an interesting approach taken by Viktor Orban, who's the prime minister in Hungary, and he has pushed what the story calls Europe's most ambitious natality agenda. Last year, he expanded tax benefits for mothers so that women under the age of 30 who have a child are exempt from paying personal income tax for life. And that's on top of other benefits like housing and child care subsidies, as well as generous maternity leaves. However, there was an expert at the U.S. Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation said that there's little evidence that these kind of policies will lead to sustained rebounds in fertility, mostly because women may get pregnant sooner to capture a baby bonus, but they're unlikely to have more kids. Now, Bill, you probably can do what I can do, is look back at my own family. I was raised by a grandfather who was one of 9 children in that his parents raised. And now if you said to somebody, we have 9 children, they look at you like you're insane. Steve's right. There is this cultural norm. But this is, Bill, I look at this and I go, do I want government to be more engaged like Viktor Orban's government is in trying to promote this? Or is there some way to better influence the culture so that people see it's okay to have more kids? We don't need them anymore to run the family farm. We do need them to run the country and the world.
You know, when obviously anybody who's paying half attention has been aware of the declining birth rates in the West for a long time now, so that's not news.
No.
But what really did surprise me about your introduction was that this falling birth rate's occurring all over the world, and that got me doing a little cogitation. Because you can say that the West is in decline and cycle of civilizations and all that other stuff, but that shouldn't affect what's happening in India, shouldn't affect what's happening around the world. And so that got me thinking, what has happened to the human race to deprive us of the single greatest drive that is in any animal species? Any species of animal is driven to reproduce above all else and to protect its young. That's why there are animals. So I started thinking about this while Steve was talking. What has happened that would deprive the entire human race of its primary evolutionary and biological imperative? And the only thing I can think of that has changed in human history, because we've never had this problem before in history, ever. We've had people dying off in plagues and wars and so on, but we've never had people just give up on having families. And the only thing I can think of, Scott, is that in the last several decades, the prosperity level of the world has gone through the ceiling as a result of free market capitalism, the industrial era, and now the information age. Mm-hmm. People are much better off all around the planet than they've ever been, and the more, pardon the grammatical massacre here. And the more better off you are, the more likely you are to not have kids. So we are being essentially going to be killed off by our own success, basically, because it seems clear to me that the more prosperous a society is, the less. It's not even a rational, conscious thing. You can rationally, consciously say, I live in the United States or Europe where we have a strong welfare state, therefore there's no reason for me to have babies. You can make that as like a rational argument, but the desire to have a family is a biological imperative. It's not a political choice. So something is changing in the biology, and I'm sad to say that I expect that the solution will be something along the lines of this, as if the population continues to shrink, and all of the things that Steve outlined and you outlined about a welfare state is a pyramid, and you can't build a pyramid upside down and all the rest of it, then sooner or later there's going to come a collapse. And when the collapse comes, there's going to be a crisis. And when the crisis comes, there's no longer going to be a welfare state. There may not be an internet. There may not even be electricity. I'm not saying that's the case, but that's a possible outcome. Sooner or later, if the population continues to decline, we will reach the point where society as we know it today has disappeared, and then people are going to be left on their own, and then people are going to be having big families again. And I don't see extinction for the human race, but I do see the possibility that that we may come to realize that too much prosperity is not only bad for us, it's unsustainable on a genetic and molecular level.
You know, I don't know why this story got to me so much. And right before we were about to record this episode, I ran across another story that provides an interesting sidebar, at least, and some sort of corollary. But, you know, it's funny because I don't know if I fully accept the argument that I made, which is there was like an economic incentive years ago. And, you know, my grandfather's parents were dairy farmers. And so having a lot of laborers on the farm made it so you didn't have to hire so many laborers. And from a very early age, my grandfather was out milking the cows and such, and throwing hay and doing all kinds of stuff like that. And there's also the argument that kids used to die off. In fact, I saw an article today that said child mortality fell in the last 200 years from 40% to 3.7%. And that's a worldwide average, from 40% to 3.7%. In fact, child mortality has continued to drop since 1990. If child mortality had continued on the path it was going in 1990, 132 million more children would have died than did. And the actual number of child deaths has gone on almost a 45-degree angle slope downwards since 1990. So, you know, praise God for that. That's wonderful. More kids are surviving. So you would say, well, I guess there's not a need to have so many children because your children are going to survive for the most part, and you don't have to worry about that. And Steve mentioned becomes this societal norm, or maybe it was Bill that mentioned it in China when they had the one-child policy, that, you know, the societal norm becomes fixed. All of those things, I think, play into it. But I think there's a missing ingredient here that I don't know how to capture with anything other than the desire produces the act, and the act produces the desire. I have 4 children, and when I met my wife, I said that ultimately I think a 6-pack would be good. We wound up not producing a 6-pack, but we have 4 children, and I love my children, and I love my wife. And it seems like the natural thing to do is to love one's spouse and then have children and love those children. And then right now, my children who are married are starting to spawn children. And so I have a grandson, and we will soon be able to see. We already have a granddaughter. We just can't see her yet. But sometime around November, we will see this granddaughter who will emerge. And this as I don't have to tell you if you've got kids or grandkids, this is joy. This is pure, unadulterated joy. There's nothing better than seeing your children thrive and grow and even struggle and learn. And so somehow, I don't want the government to do this, but somehow we in the older generation who still has touch with a time when people had more than 1.2 children, somehow we need to convey the power of that love and joy to the next generation. They're not going to have more babies because they need to take care of the farm, and they're not going to have more babies because they're afraid some are dying off, and they're not going to have more babies based on any kind of numerical norm. But they might have more babies when they hold one. They might have more babies when they look into when I look into the eyes of my wife and think, I want a lot of people around here that are like you. That somehow we need to get that into the hearts and minds of young people. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.